evening, welcome, and thank you for joining us tonight for our lecture with Dr. Mia Bloom on the anti-Semitic roots of QAnon. My name is Audrey Lichter, the Executive Director of Chai Mitzvah, the Resource Center for Jewish Engagement. Chai Mitzvah is a national organization now celebrating its 15th year and is the sponsor of Scholar Circle. We are a Jewish resource center that focuses on building community through Jewish engagement programs and materials. We have over 20 curricula tailored for small group conversation for teens, adults, lay, or professionally led. Our newest initiative is the 10 Times Stronger campaign, which responds to the war in Israel and rising anti-Semitism by strengthening our peoplehood, identity, and purpose. For more information, please visit our website at chaimitzvah.org. The Scholar Circle program was inspired by Scott Shea. Scott is our founder and board president, who authored a best-selling book called Conspiracy U, A Case Study, which unpacks anti-Zionist conspiracy theories from the left and the right political spectrum. You can purchase Scott's book along with the accompanying curriculum on our Chai Mitzvah website for only $18. This curriculum has been taught to hundreds of college students and others. The curriculum was also taught in a recorded series by Dr. Andrew Pessin, one of our esteemed scholars. You can find it on our website. You will receive all this information in a follow-up email as well. The Scholar Circle hosts scholars every 2 weeks on topics relating to Israel and the Jewish community, geared towards rabbis, educators, and lay leaders who are charged with explaining the complex issues the Jewish community is facing. To that end, each lecture will have a resource guide that will be sent to you after the lecture. A recording of each lecture will be accessible on our website and shared with you. Our featured scholar tonight is Dr. Mia Bloom, an International Security Fellow at New America and a professor at Georgia State University. She speaks 8 languages and has authored 6 books on violent extremism, including Dying to Kill and Bombshell. Her most recent book, Veiled Threats, coming out in the winter of 2025, will explore the diverse roles of women involved in jihad. Mia has held appointments at Cornell, Harvard, Princeton, and McGill, and serves on several counter-radicalization boards. She holds a PhD from Columbia University and advanced degrees from Georgetown and McGill. Before I welcome our scholar, a couple of housekeeping items. To submit questions, please use the Q&A button on your screen. Q&A will be held at about 40 minutes into the lecture, but you can submit questions anytime throughout. The lecture recording will be sent to your email in a few days and will be available on our website at chaimitzvah.org. Now to Dr. Mia Bloom.
So we're just going to jump right into it, to the anti-Semitic roots of QAnon. So if you're unfamiliar, QAnon began as an online conspiracy movement that claimed that there was a cabal of Satan-worshiping pedophiles who were secretly ruling the world. And so many of the core beliefs of QAnon contain elements that you would be familiar with from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was basically a pamphlet that was created by the Tsar secret police in 1903. Now, the protocols talk about a global cabal of blood-drinking elites. And so QAnon went from being this fringe conspiracy theory that was on 4chan and then 8chan to one that was embraced by not just political leaders around the world, but even members of the US House of Representatives. So in many ways, it's a modern version of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, driven by conspiracies and social media about blood-drinking cabals and manipulation of wars or manipulation of politics by this shady group of elites. The main tenets of QAnon say that there are Democrats, Hollywood celebrities, and the royal family are trafficking in children and drinking their blood, that President Donald Trump had a secret plan to bring the group to justice and to, quote unquote, save the children. So QAnon begins on October of 2017, but in March of 2020, that's when the conspiracy theory really began to be very popular, and it moved from the underbelly of the internet, which is the chats, to more open APIs like Facebook or Instagram. And that's when you really started to see new audiences in the US and around the world. Now, you can track this, that from the beginning of QAnon, October 29th of 2017, you see the interest in the conspiracy theory was relatively flat. And what really instigated the uptick is the lockdowns that accompanied the pandemic in March of 2020. According to the Wall Street Journal, it was a 600% uptick in people talking and posting about QAnon. And so really, it's hard to look at QAnon and its popularity without understanding the effect of the pandemic. Now, my co-author, Dr. Sofia Moskalenko, explains why during a pandemic, you're more likely to see conspiracy theories. And she talks about unfrozen social domains. And again, I'm going to try to do her work justice because we wrote the book together, that basically people have very strongly held beliefs, whether it's about religion or science or gender roles. So, for example, I'm of an age that there were boys and girls. I mean, there wasn't another category. Whereas if you're of a certain age, the current discussions about non-binary or transgender, you might feel that this is very discombobulating. This is not what you're familiar with, and it's not what you grew up with. And so the idea is that when these firm beliefs are being shaken, you become more susceptible to believing in the conspiracy theories. And, you know, QAnon, within QAnon, you can see you have a lot of different conspiracy theories that were folded in, including ones that began way before October 2017. And so, in many ways, we talked about how QAnon is almost like a sticky ball rolling down a hill, picking up along the way all the other conspiracy theories, many of which predated, and some of these things became sort of originally not connected to QAnon, but now we associate them with QAnon. And as a result, people have a tendency to feel sort of this great positive feeling in the what we she talks about as utilities, whether it's pride or belonging, outrage or fulfillment, that as people began to go through QAnon and figure out the different puzzles associated with figuring, doing your own research, there were different kinds of positive associations. People felt clever. They felt that they were able to see something that nobody else could, that they were able to figure out. They felt smarter than people around them. It also explains why they had such a feeling of almost proselytizing, that they had to share their knowledge with everyone else. And this was something associated with people who discovered QAnon, that they wouldn't stop talking about it. Now, according to other theories, conspiracy theories satisfy important social psychological motives. One characterizes epistemic, the desire for understanding or subjective certainty, an existential desire for control and security. So during the pandemic, we had this novel coronavirus. We didn't know anything about it. We didn't know, for example, how it spread. There was there was a great confusion and a lack of understanding. Did the mask protect you, or did the mask protect you from me? So this desire to understand the world better, to feel more security, contributed to the need for an explanation. And then finally, the social motive, that it was a desire to maintain a positive image of yourself. So this is where you started to feel, more clever, more intelligent. Now, nearly 4 in 5 Americans who believe in the protocols of the Elders of Zion also subscribe to QAnon. Now, we know from the history that the protocols of the Elders of Zion was translated into English and brought to the United States by the car manufacturer Henry Ford. And this really was the basis leading up to World War II for the America First movement in the 30s, Father Coughlin's radio show in Michigan, that was embedding anti-Semitism with this desire to stay out of World War II, not to fight the Germans, as well as we've seen recent pictures of a Nazi rally in Madison Square Garden in New York. So there was an American Nazi Party. The fact is, The Protocols of the Elder Design remains one of the most popular books till this day. It's been published in over 100 different languages. It's readily available on almost every street corner in the Middle East. I can't tell you how many times, I would encounter it in Arabic, and it's really very sort of well received in places that appreciate conspiracy theories. Now, a lot of what the protocols and QAnon have in common have to do with blood libels. There's a famous wood carving from, believe it or not, 1695, from a series entitled Ritual Murder in Bavarian Localities. And this was this idea, of course, if you know anything about kashrut, you know it's completely a fallacy, but that the Jews were using the blood, not in this image, but generally the blood of children who had not yet been baptized, so babies, in order to bake matzot. And of course, anyone that knows anything about kashrut knows that there's a real allergy to blood. I mean, first of all, a lot of kashrut is juxtaposed against the pagan religions that used blood sacrifice. But also, in the process of koshering meat, you're soaking and salting it 3 different times in order to leach out all the blood. And so, this idea that Jews would be using blood is the antithesis to most of the dietary laws. Nevertheless, it gained traction from the 13th century on. There was a part of the Catholic Church, especially around Easter, would really whip up the masses. And, one of the precursors to many of the attacks on Jewish communities throughout Europe usually tended to be Easter, which might have coincided with Passover, and this argument from the church and church fathers that Jews were using the blood of unbaptized babies. So this idea of ritual murder or the use of blood as a blood libel is really very firmly ensconced and embedded in the QAnon lore. QAnon blames the Jews for the world wars and all the other disasters. And so some of these images that I'm sharing with you now come from QAnon on Telegram, in part because QAnon moves from 4chan and 8chan to other platforms like Facebook and Instagram when these venues began to be a little bit inhospitable to QAnon, and they started limiting QAnon's reach, or at least with Instagram, they started shuttering some of the QAnon accounts. What we saw was QAnon moved to Telegram, which was a Russian platform that really had no limitations. Jews were blamed for critical race theory, homosexuality, and Satanism. So, for example, the CRT argument that really emerges since 2018 about the role of CRT, whether it's taught in grade schools or colleges or in law school, became embedded with this idea of Satanism and blood libels and this moral panic. Jews were blamed for the slave trade. And in fact, this is something that some of the QAnon channels promoted, but it's also promoted by people like Louis Farrakhan. So this is something that is totally untrue. 78% of slave owners were not Jewish. And, Jews in the South owned slaves probably at a percentage less than sort of the average, but there are bits and pieces of information that have been published in order to use this to demonize Jews. And this, again, becomes part of the QAnon argument about how the Jews are ruling the world, but also ruining the world. Now, one of the things that's very interesting is QAnon uses Jeffrey Epstein as the sort of example, the premium example of how there's a cabal of elites that are sex trafficking and Epstein's case, young girls, and they were connecting Epstein to Netanyahu and to the state of Israel, even showing this this building on Epstein's Island that he was flying people to, that it looks like a talus, or it looks like the Israeli flag, because this temple, which, you know, we don't know what the temple was used for, is blue and white stripes like the Israeli flag. And so you can see this is again from QAnon channels that are making the connection between Epstein, Dershowitz, Epstein, and Netanyahu, and then all of these other very famous Jews. Now, Jews are also blamed for porn. This is an age-old argument that Jews are basically undermining the moral fabric of society. And so what you have then is you have this argument that if there's porn, the Jews are behind it in order to sort of promote this moral turpitude. They were blamed also for the coronavirus. And so this again, you see an overlap between what QAnon says and what the far right says, as far as, you know, Jews are manipulating politics, they're manipulating financial markets, controlling the media, and they're ultimately responsible for all of the disasters that befall not just the United States, but the world. Now, the big bad, for example, in QAnon, are both the Rothschild family and George Soros. The way Soros and the Rothschilds are depicted, that they're deeply involved in this evil project of billionaires exploiting the pandemic. They argued that they owned COVID-19 patents and that they were actually manufacturing the disease. And so it's interesting that, you know, sort of the Rothschilds are a proxy for the Jews controlling the banks. And George Soros is also considered evil because he's manipulated currency exchanges, and that's, you know, the argument is that's how he made his money. Also, QAnon repeats a lot of the far right tropes about how Jews control the media. And so this is, again, not from a far right Telegram channel, but from QAnon, looking at all the different news stations and, you know, putting a Jewish star next to the reporter. And this is whether they're Jewish or whether they're married to a Jew. But the argument is that the media, the mainstream media, or as they call it, the lamestream media, can't be trusted as a source of news because ultimately it's controlled by Jews. Where it became really pernicious is the extent to which QAnon infiltrated into the American political system. Now, in 2020, before the 2020 election, there were 47 candidates in the primaries that spouted QAnon ideology. And then of those, a handful ran for election, and two, Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert, were elected, and they were reelected. So this is sort of the Q caucuses, as it's now been derisively called. Now, although it's very much associated with the Republican Party, it's not only Republicans that believe in QAnon. Although a year after QAnon appears on 4chan, they started showing up at Republican rallies. This is in 2018. You can see this is in Florida. There's Governor DeSantis and future President Trump. And part of what makes this complicated and problematic is that President Trump has consistently refused to disavow QAnon, even though the things that they're saying are horrible. It's not just anti-Semitic, it's homophobic, it's anti-immigrant, it's racist. And so there is one point of view that QAnon forms one of the most loyal bases to support President Trump. And that might be one of the reasons that he's been reticent to completely disavow them. And so, for example, when he was asked in the 2016 debates, you know, about QAnon, he made like, oh, I don't even know who they are. But starting in 2022, during the midterms, he started wearing a QAnon lapel pin and using the QAnon theme music as he went onto the stage. Now, in the 2020 primaries, as I mentioned, you had there were 24 congressional candidates on the ballot from the 97 that we started with. And as you saw before, Lauren Boebert and Marjorie Taylor Greene won. Now, if you were to look at the Electoral College map, you would see that the places that have the most QAnon voters are also places that tended to vote Republican. But according to the Washington Post, it's not only Republicans. So this is the mainstay of the QAnon lore. The question was asked by the Center for American Life, which is AEI. The American Enterprises Institute is a conservative think tank in DC. In January 2021, they asked a bunch of questions for the survey. One of them said, do you agree or disagree that Donald Trump has been secretly fighting a group of child sex traffickers that include prominent Democrats and Hollywood elites? And so you could see 6% of people who said yes self-identify as Democrats, and many of these at the time in 2021 might have been ex-Bernie bros. But what we've seen is we've seen a massive uptick, not just among conservatives that believe in QAnon and, for example, evangelicals, but we've seen an uptick in the yoga community, in the vegan community, in the natural childbirth and breastfeeding communities on social media, on Facebook, on Instagram. And so it's something that's bipartisan, although as you can see, it's much more heavily present among Republicans and especially among evangelicals. And more up to date in November 2024, you see that again, among QAnon believers, 80% were people who were going to vote for Donald Trump, and only 19% were going to vote for Kamala. And so we see that Republicans are more likely than independents and Democrats to be QAnon believers, that they hold favorable views of President Trump. And so they're 5 times as likely as those who hold unfavorable views to believe in QAnon. And that a lot of it depends on where people get their news from. If they're getting their news from Fox News or to the right of Fox News, like OAN or some of the online platforms, then like Alex Jones, then you're seeing a massive uptick in people who trust that source and believe in QAnon versus trusting mainstream media. Now, it's really important to understand that the online platforms have played a crucial role in disseminating both QAnon content and making QAnon so popular that if that AEI poll is representative, if it's a representative sample of Americans, you're looking at over 20 million Americans that believe in a blood-drinking cabal. And as much as we thought it might be over after the 2020 election, we've seen a massive uptick both in anti-Semitism, Holocaust denial, and references to QAnon, including, as you see, this is from October of 2024, that Elon Musk was promoting videos referencing QAnon as part of his support. And then we saw, for example, one of the most prominent QAnon influencers on Telegram, Ghost Ezra, who had 300,000 followers, talking about the fact that, discussing the Holocaust was Spielberg propaganda, that racism is created by Zionists. So anti-Zionism and QAnon are, very comfortable bedfellows. Social media, as I mentioned, between 2018 and 2020 clamped down on QAnon, but it made a resurgence in 2024. Reddit, although was the first place after the 4chans and 8chan to have QAnon content, acted fairly early in 2018 by banning QAnon content. But QAnon did, like ISIS did when it was banned for social media, is that it started using coded language. It moved to Telegram, for example, as I mentioned, Ghost Ezra, where again, Zionists are blamed for 9/11, or Zionists are blamed for ruling the world and ultimately being Satanists. The coded language, when they were temporarily deplatformed, was saying, don't use QAnon, say 17 anon, or misspell Q like CUE anon. But they were always used to using coded language because for them, the original QAnon being Pizzagate, that, pizza was representative for some sort of sexual exploitation of children. So they would have all these different ways. Pasta was a little boy. This is really racist. Walnut was children of color. Cheese was a little girl. So cheese pizza was, sexual abuse of a little girl. And this is connected to in 2016 when John Podesta's emails were hacked he kept talking about Comet Ping Pong Pizzeria. So for them, this was the real code. And this predates October 2017. But of course, Pizzagate gets folded into QAnon, along with all those other conspiracy theories that the moon landing was fake, that 9/11 was an inside job, that the 5G cell towers were, monitoring people or causing people to get cancer. Like all of the pre-existing conspiracy theories gets folded in. Now, QAnon, I think, became more prevalent or known to people in January 6th, because so many people who went to the Capitol were QAnon supporters. So, for example, the very famous picture of Jake Angeli with the face painting and the horns. But it's interesting that the very first person who died at the Capitol was Ashley Babbitt, a QAnon supporter. When she first died, right away, the QAnon supporters said, "Oh no, she's a plant. She's not really a Republican," and they tried to make her into Antifa. That didn't last very long. Eventually, Ashley Babbitt becomes sort of a rallying point for QAnon as well as for the MAGA cult of MAGA. What happens is, starting in 2018, a number of law enforcement and intelligence agencies began to suggest that there was a possibility that QAnon had the potential for terrorism. And that's actually what motivated Dr. Moskalenko and I to look at QAnon so seriously, because we had been studying and working on terrorism for, decades. And so we thought, well, is this conspiracy theory, a terrorist group? Is it going to be the next ISIS, the way some people were prognosticating? And in fact, what we found is that there was a number of crimes, but the vast majority of crimes up until January 6th were very personal in nature. Most of them were interpersonal. And what we deduced was that QAnon was more likely to be dangerous to themselves than to others. The difference, however, and we see this on January 6th, is when people are in some ways intersectional. They believe in QAnon, but they also have other beliefs. So that they might be far right, they might be Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, Three Percenters. So the dangerous part is being a member of the far right militias or the Oath Keepers or the KKK. But if they also believed in QAnon, that's where we started to see this overlap. And so, for example, here's an image, in case you've never seen it, of the Gadsden flag, which is ordinarily the snake is coiled and it says, "Don't tread on me." And it's sort of the flag for, people who don't want to pay taxes and don't recognize the authority of the US government. But here instead, the snake is in the shape of a Q, and it's using their phrase, "Where we go one, we go all." So that's where I think, the real danger came, not from people, who were sharing QAnon memes and were relatively harmless, except again to themselves and to members of their own family. But the real harm or the real danger came from members of militias or the far right racist groups who then were very comfortable with the anti-Semitism of QAnon. And so they lobbed on or to QAnon and were both. And one of the things you can do is by looking at Jake Angeli's tattoos, you can see that intersectionality play out. So, he's not going to admit that he's far right, but he's got the far right tattoos. This is from Norse mythology on his body. So he's very clearly believing in the far right to have these tattoos while at the same time advocating on behalf of QAnon. And again, there was a contagion, not just in the United States, but QAnon spread to Canada, the UK, Australia, but all over the globe. And so Dr. Moskalenko mapped it in as many as 85 different countries. And recently there was a study looking at the percentages of QAnon messaging in different languages, including Hebrew. And that was the part that was really so surprising, is that an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that embodied so many of these tropes from the protocols and talked about blood libels would actually be in Hebrew as well. And they had, again, unabashedly, this idea of Jews drinking blood, and this is all in Hebrew, as well as they were promoting in Hebrew. This is also from Telegram, all of the anti-Semitic content that you would expect from QAnon. So this is, again, doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And this is really a lingering question as to why there would be Hebrew language QAnon channels promoting anti-Semitic content, as well as building on racist tropes that men of color and Jews were coming for white children. And so, for example, we did a study where we looked at 250 images of the QAnon hashtag Save the Children and compared it to the actual Save the Children charity by the same name. And what was interesting is that 93% of Save the Children children were children of color, because when you're talking about the as many as 300,000 children who are trafficked a year, most of them come from the global south. But when you looked at the QAnon children in the Save the Children hashtag, they were 97% white. And so, again, the idea was to try to activate white suburban women to be very concerned and get them mobilized, because what had happened was from 2016 to 2018, white suburban women did not come out in great numbers in favor of Republicans. And for 2020, they needed this group to vote. And as we saw from the election, just a few weeks ago, this is a very important demographic. So we know that QAnon is anti-Semitic, but it's also racist. And we did the study to show this 97 to 93%, that when they're talking about children, they're not actually talking about children genuinely being trafficked. They're talking about white children to appeal to this, female demographic in the suburbs. The other way that QAnon spreads this message globally is it portrays leaders, no matter what their politics are, wearing a kippah, wearing a skull cap. And so it could be everyone from Clinton to, King Charles. It doesn't matter whether the person is Jewish or not. They're going to have images of them wearing a kippah to show how really the Jews are controlling them, controlling leaders around the world, no matter what political party. And we saw global disinformation spread to places like the UK in 2020. There were 10 different rallies. Again, reviving this notion of Pizzagate and QAnon, despite the fact that Pizzagate had been disproven, that the person who drove from North Carolina to the Ping Pong Comet Pizzeria in Washington, D.C., to shoot it up in order to save the children in the basement, only to discover that there was no basement. Edgar Welch himself has admitted that he was fooled and that there's no such thing. And it doesn't matter. It's still, Pizzagate is still a central feature of argumentation of QAnon. We also saw that the rise of QAnon in places like Germany explains the putsch in 2022 in December, where there was a temporary group of military officers in the German military, combined with someone from the former royal family who believed in QAnon. That failed, but it definitely shows the spread of QAnon globally. I'm going to stop here and thank you so much for your time. Take any questions you have. I'm going to stop sharing my slides. This is our book, Pastels and Pedophiles, Inside the Mind of QAnon. And one of the things that Dr. Moskalenko did that was of particular use and importance, because there were so many people who had fallen down this proverbial rabbit hole that were spouting anti-Semitic tropes. Again, they could even be Jewish. I found out, for example, that I have a cousin who believes in QAnon. And again, it's an anti-Semitic belief system. She has in the book ways to get your relatives and your friends and your family out of QAnon. So I want to just recommend that. And I look forward to your questions. And I'll stop the share now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Bloom. Let's see. There's a number of questions. So let's get started. Calvin Blinder asks, what distinguishes those who adopt QAnon belief from those who don't? Are there any fringe beliefs that people have adopted in lieu of QAnon beliefs? So what distinguishes people who take on these QAnon beliefs?
Well, so up until 2020, if you believe that there was a global cabal of sex trafficking, blood drinking elites, you didn't have to call yourself QAnon. That was basically that was the distinguishing feature. Um, One of the other things is distrust in democracy, distrust in US institutions, believing that Jews are controlling things or that George Soros is controlling the COVID-19 virus. It's not necessarily just people supporting Trump, although people tended, if they believed in QAnon, they tended more likely to be Trump supporters or Bernie bros. But because QAnon went underground, they were deplatformed for at least 6 months in the lead up to the 2020 election. Um, and we know from Frances Haugen's testimony before Congress that, the people were generally only like 3 clicks away from QAnon content. Facebook was fully aware that this was the case, so they put the guardrails on before the 2020 election, but they took them off after the election. And I think that that's one of the things you started to see. But again, we try to understand people who believed in QAnon as perhaps being motivated by an altruistic desire to, save the children or help people who were being trafficked. We didn't want to assume that every single person who believed in the conspiracy was an anti-Semitic, horrible racist, because there were so many people that believed in it. We wanted to give people some understanding and some empathy for why they might believe in it. But there were people who were educated. There was a woman profiled in the New York Times who had a master's degree from Harvard. So it wasn't like you could stereotype the QAnon believers in any way by just calling them, dumb or uneducated or racist. It really wasn't just that. It really engulfed so many people. Now, after the 2020 election, there was a bit of a lull, and there was an uptick again in 2022. And the fact that someone like Elon Musk is promoting QAnon content again in October of 2024 means that we are perhaps poised for a resurgence, especially since a lot of people associated with QAnon, like disgraced General Michael Flynn, might be brought back into government. And if that's the case, we are probably going to see more people in the QAnon caucus than fewer.
To follow up that, Lauren Blatt asks, what is the relationship between QAnon and MAGA? And do you believe Donald Trump believes in QAnon conspiracies?
I'm going to go without having ever spoken to President Trump. I don't think that he personally believes any of it. I think that he's an adept politician that understands that in QAnon ideology, he is like a messianic like figure. They have him, they have images of him with Jesus or being inspired by Jesus, or a young Donald Trump, and Jesus is like right there over his shoulder. I think that, he loves the adulation that they give him because they've elevated him to like this cult like status. He's Q prime, or he's the original, or they look for any little um, messages. So, for example, at some point, he refers to the Easter Bunny as, I call him Tippy Top. And in one of the 5,000 Q drops, none of which predicted accurately anything that in fact happened. But in one of the Q drops, a test of Donald Trump being with them was he was going to say tippy top, and then it said tippy top, and they saw that as validation. The fact that during the debates he refused to disavow them, and he said in one of his briefings in the White House, he was asked, do you disavow QAnon? And he says, well, I hear that they like to protect children. That doesn't sound like a bad thing to me. So, I mean, he's really had this plausible deniability up until 2022. During the midterm elections in 2022, he was actively campaigning at QAnon events, wearing a Q on his lapel and using the QAnon music. But as we saw from the election, it certainly didn't hurt him in November. So I think that he will always find this group of people to be his hardest and most devoted supporters. But I mean, again, because QAnon is anti Semitic and is so awful, and the blood drinking, I don't think that he believes in any of that. But I also think that, he knows what side his toast is buttered, and he likes a group that loves him. And, he's going to have this sort of uncomfortable relationship, because if QAnon is so anti-Semitic and Ivanka and Jared are Orthodox Jews, there's a problem there. There's a tension.
So, talking about the left, Gloria Margolis says, I have read that George Soros's Open Society and his Tides Foundation have contributed to pro-Hamas and anti-Israel and anti-Jewish organizations. What do you know about that?
I know, I'm glad that, Gloria, thank you for the question. This came up before. So I think it's sort of indirect. There's Jewish Voices for Peace, JVP, which is anything but. I mean, it's the group that portrayed during the encampments at Columbia University the Seder plate, and they didn't know that Hebrew was written, from right to left instead of left to right. Um, I think that Soros has supported indirectly. So let's say Soros Foundation gives money to a campus, like a liberal, some sort of liberal group of liberal organizations and movements, and then they gave money to the Students Justice for Peace in Palestine, or Jewish Voices for Peace. So so is it JVP and SJP, which have turned out to be horrific organizations that, do not represent the vast majority of Jewish people. I think it's something like 80 to 85% of Jewish people are Zionists. And so they'll find like the handful of anti-Zionist Jews that are throwing around casually, ridiculous statements, or my favorite is the most recent thing out of Gaza, that apparently the Israelis have developed a phaser that can eliminate someone, that there's no evidence, there's no more body. And I saw a joke that said, well, that's where all those casualties are, that they can't prove that there's a body because, they went up in smoke. Or, for example, Marjorie Taylor Greene talked about Jewish space lasers. So again, she's been rabidly anti-Semitic. When she's been called on her anti-Semitism, she's gone to the Holocaust Museum, she's made a pilgrimage, she made an apology, and then she goes right back to her anti-Semitic tropes. But as far as Soros is concerned, I think that there's a great misunderstanding. A lot of what QAnon doesn't like about Soros, George, or his son Alex is the support for Democratic candidates in all of the so in the November election, there was a lot of money given from Soros to Democratic candidates. And I think also Alex is marrying Hillary Clinton's former assistant. I mean, there's ensconcement of the Soros family and foundation. But this idea of George Soros being the bad guy, it's a proxy for Jews controlling the banks, controlling currency. So he's been the bad guy from Hungary ever since. So I think that, again, I'm not very knowledgeable about the Soros Foundation and the family. They give a lot of money to new immigrants. They give a lot of money for research. They give a lot of money to what we would call progressive causes. And I think that those groups that were considered progressive, they all flipped. And after October 7th of 2023 began sort of spouting pro-Hamas propaganda. So, for example, the LGBT groups on campus that were pro-Hamas, and I'm sitting there thinking, oh, what do we say in the South? Bless your heart, right? That if they were in Gaza, they would be thrown off the tallest building in a heartbeat. And this is the thing that we really don't understand. And I will say, I mean, again, I haven't seen the data yet doing the Monday morning quarterbacking, but I think a lot of people voted for Trump because they looked at what was going on the campuses and they were looking what was going on the left and they said, this is too much. And so the pendulums swung way too far over.
Hmm, right. Okay, so David Spiel asks about the Bilderberg Society myth. Do you know anything about that?
I don't know about the Bilderberg Society, and I feel bad that there's a question I
Okay.
don't know. But you know what? While Audrey asks the next question, I'm gonna Google it and find out.
Okay. Well, the next question, okay. Well, the next question is related to, again, anti-vaxxers and QAnon. What is their link? And why would they be connected?
Okay, so it's interesting that a lot. Remember, I mentioned that 6% of people identified in the American Enterprises Institute poll as Democrats. There was a lot of people on the left who were already very suspicious about the utility of vaccines and whether vaccines, for example, caused autism, which they don't, or whether COVID-19, that the vaccine was developed too quickly. Although the fact that it was developed under Trump's presidency should have worked in the favor of people who love Trump to take the vaccine, and he himself advocated on behalf of it.
Mhm.
I think that the COVID-19 conspiracy is part of the left, sort of the left-leaning conspiracies about, I saw, for example, if you took the COVID-19 vaccine, you would become magnetic. I've had 8 shots and I'm very disappointed. I'm still not Magneto. I'm still not magnetic, but it was part of this overall suspicion. Remember how I showed you the unfrozen domains that Dr. Moskalenko came out with? People have stopped having a great deal of confidence in science and in doctors. And part of this is connected to the opioid pandemic and the fact that doctors were prescribing opioids knowing fully well that they were addictive and pretending that they weren't, that big pharma has made so much money despite the fact that the opioid pandemic has taken hundreds of thousands of people that have died, or worse, they've gone through the ringer, and their families. And so what I would say is that all of this suspiciousness about science and vaccines and is correlated to not just the left, but to an overall lack of confidence in American institutions. I've looked at this Bilderberg thing, just I want to go back because apparently the Bilderberg Group is a group of politicians and financiers who get together. So I'm guessing that it looks like the protocols that talks about a cabal of leaders, but there are, a number of leaders that they get together And so apparently it's between 120 and 150 are invited by a committee, and that they meet in the Netherlands starting from 1954 on. I'll be honest with you, apparently that they are partly responsible for the Marshall Plan, but I hadn't heard of them. So I really want to thank it was David who mentioned it. So David, thank you so much for enlightening me. So it goes to show you that we give these talks, Scholar Circle, and we, the scholars, learn from you as much as you learn from us.
Um, another Jill Smith asked about a documentary called Into the Storm. Are you
So
familiar with that?
the HBO, yeah.
Yeah.
So we talked about that in the book because we had finished the book, and then Into the Storm HBO show, was aired, and we, made sure that everything was copacetic. And a lot of what Into the Storm was about was discovering who was really Q. And I think what happened is, it took so many years to make the documentary. And, you've got Frederick Brennan, he's flying around in private jets all over, and they're following him. And in some ways, they almost made Brennan out to be like an anti-hero. And I didn't agree with that part. I also didn't agree with the fact that they were airing like live feed of mass casualty attacks, for example, in New Zealand. This is something that you're not supposed to put in a movie or on social media. It's the reason why we have these agreements with the Global Internet Forum to counter terrorism. So I didn't love the HBO series, in part because I think by the time it aired, the people who believed in QAnon could not care less who Q actually was. And they didn't even come to a conclusion. They presented a bunch of different hypotheses about who Q might be, but in the end, it didn't matter because the people who believe in QAnon and subscribe to those beliefs, it wouldn't matter to them if like Lynn Wood now disavows Q, or if you have the people who were promoting QAnon then turn around and no longer. And someone said to me, are the people in the documentary still active? Some of them yes, some of them no. There's a number of high profile people who have left QAnon, like Chitath Jadarja from Australia, or Melissa Rain Lively from Arizona, who left QAnon. But there's kind of an element of grift to QAnon with some of these influencers. They either became famous, or they made money, or they're selling something. And so, again, I wonder how much of it do they genuinely believe versus how much are they profiting off of promoting QAnon, and now being celebrity. Like there's a category like Ed Hussein and others, we call it celebrity ex-terrorists, people who are former terrorists who now make a $10,000 speaking fee to talk about their life back in Al-Qaeda or in Hamas. And again, you kind of have to wonder, what is the ultimate motivation when there's that much money involved? So I apologize if I sound a little bit untrusting.
I do have a question about the relationship between Islamic jihadism and QAnon. Is there any connection? It seems as though they're both out to get the Jews, but coming from different places. And what's the difference in their motivation?
Audrey, that's such a brilliant question. And the picture I showed of the map, and you guys will have, from the video that's archived at Scholar Circle, you'll have from Chai Mitzvah to be able to look at it again. But one of the things that struck Dr. Moskalenko and I was that there was very little QAnon in Arabic. We even looked for it. We have a colleague, Nellie Lahoud, who's the preeminent expert on jihadism. And Nellie and I were like, we're gonna look for hub al-atfal, pedophilia. Like we started to look for all the different Arabic permutations of what might be QAnon online, and we found very little. And so we thought, well, why is the Middle East seemingly inoculated from QAnon? And part of what she discovered was they don't have freedom of speech, freedom of expression. They really can't clamp down with censorship on social media, so that they didn't let QAnon go crazy. But where it's really emerged has been since October 7th, has been a lot of the conspiracy theories about what is going on in Gaza. For example, that Israel is killing Palestinians to take body parts or to steal organs, or killing the babies, like in the numbers that they're claiming, that these are some of the QAnon dog whistles without saying QAnon. And, part of it might be that it's just not popular to talk about pedophilia and sex trafficking in the Middle East. And part of it might be that we're seeing a lot of actual sex trafficking, whether it's Yazidi women. It was a Yazidi girl found in Gaza after 10 years. And just this week, we saw with the Syrian civil war in full rage that these Al-Qaeda groups have started capturing Kurdish women to be what they call sabaya, which are sex slaves. So it's not in the Middle East, although conspiracies about Jews are very popular, and allegations about what Israel is doing and not doing is really popular. It's one of the things that Sophia and I have been tracking as a sort of extension of the book. We've been looking at the conspiracies associated both with Ukraine as well as with the Gaza war, and how much of this is coming from Russia. So I've often wondered how much of QAnon, at least initially, was promoted not just by Russia, but remember, Telegram is a Russian platform, but also by people who were being paid and to promote these conspiracy theories. So I'm very suspicious of Russia, and the fact that it suits Vladimir Putin to promote anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. It's like 1903 all over again. The Tsarist secret police started the protocols, and Putin has continued them.
In just the minute we have left, Dr. Bloom, do you have anything else you want to leave us with that you haven't had a chance to talk about?
One of the things that Sophia talks about when and this came up because there were people on the left saying at Thanksgiving, don't invite, people who have different politics than you, disinvite your relatives. I think it's really important that we keep the lines of communication open and that we start from a position of empathy. We're never going to get anywhere if we look at the other side and we say, what a bunch of idiots. Now, we can talk about the fact, like Gays for Gaza, I think they're barking up the wrong tree. But I think the better way to engage people in these conversations, to have productive and fruitful engagement, so that if people believe in QAnon, we can get them out of the rabbit hole rather than just let them twist on their own in their misery and in their mental illness.
Wow. Okay. Well, we'll look forward to seeing you again later on in December, I believe. So thank you again for this.
I think we're in January. This one's
January.
December. This one I think might be January 13th.
Okay, January 13th. So our next Scholars Circle features Dr. Andrew Pessin. The topic will be a new kind of response to anti-Israel claims. Please join us on Monday, December 16th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Thank you again. We look forward to seeing you again, and thank you all for joining us tonight. And please let your friends and colleagues know about the Scholar Circle to grow this conversation. Thank you again. We'll see you on December the 16th at 7 p.m. with Dr. Pessin. Good night, everyone.
Happy holidays, everyone.